My dad was my hero. He was the kind of person who made people feel safe, who stood firm in his values, and who, above all, loved his family fiercely. When I lost him at 17, it felt like the ground beneath my feet disappeared. The years since have been about rebuilding that sense of stability and learning to navigate life without him. My mum, in her own way, did the same. She's always been strong, though she rarely lets people see the cracks. After Dad passed, she focused on me and on keeping our home together. For a long time, she didn't show interest in dating, and I assumed she wouldn't. Maybe it was naive, but I believed her love for Dad was so enduring that she wouldn't want anyone else. Now I'm 26 and life has moved forward in ways I couldn't have anticipated back then. My mum has found someone new, a man who's nothing like my dad. It's not just that he's different, it's who he is. This man, let's call him Rick, isn't a stranger. He's someone my dad worked with for years, someone my dad openly disliked. It wasn't a mild aversion either. They had what could only be described as bad blood, and that animosity was mutual. Mum's choice of Rick as a partner stunned me. I didn't know how to feel at first, but a deep discomfort settled in quickly. The memories of my dad's disdain for him, combined with the pain of losing Dad, made this relationship feel like an unexpected betrayal. I couldn't help but question how she could overlook such a significant part of our shared history. And yet, I love my mum. I want her to be happy, but this situation has left me torn. It all started 2 years ago. At first, Mum kept it under wraps, mentioning only in passing that she'd been spending time with someone from her past. She didn't share details, which wasn't unusual for her. She's private about her personal life, even with me. But eventually the pieces began to come together, and when she told me it was Rick, I felt like the air had been knocked out of me. Rick wasn't just another guy from my dad's job. He was the guy my dad couldn't stand. Their feud spanned nearly 2 decades, and it wasn't petty workplace drama. It was deeply rooted. I don't know every detail. My dad wasn't the type to air his grievances extensively, but I do know enough. They had clashed on everything from work ethics to personal values. If Rick said the sky was blue, my dad probably would have argued it was green. It was that bad. When my dad passed, his colleagues were supportive. They sent a card with heartfelt messages from nearly everyone in the office. Nearly everyone. Rick didn't sign it. I remember my mom noticing at the time and remarking on how petty it seemed. It wasn't surprising though. Dad wouldn't have signed a card for him either. Now the man my dad couldn't stand is my mom's partner. She tells me they reconnected by chance and discovered they had more in common than they realized. She says they bring out the best in each other and that this relationship has made her feel alive again. I wanted to believe her, but it felt impossible. How could she see past everything that had happened? I tried to stay neutral at first. I told myself it wasn't my place to judge her choices, but the more serious their relationship became, the harder it was to suppress my feelings. Mom started using words like love and future to describe them, and I couldn't shake the sense of unease that grew every time she spoke about him. It felt like my dad's memory was being pushed aside, and I didn't know how to make sense of it. When Mom first shared how serious things were getting with Rick, I didn't know how to react. I remember sitting across from her at the kitchen table, the same place we had countless conversations about Dad after he passed. But this time, the warmth and understanding that usually defined our talks were missing. Her excitement about Rick collided head-on with the storm of emotions brewing inside me. I tried to keep my feelings in check, but the words slipped out before I could stop them. Are you really serious about this guy? It wasn't just the question, it was the tone. Sharp, disbelieving, maybe even a little accusatory. Mom paused, her face tightening as if she'd been bracing for this reaction. Yes, I am, she replied firmly, her voice calm, but with an edge of defiance I hadn't heard from her before. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to scream that it was wrong, that this man had no place in our lives. But another part of me, the part that loved my mom and wanted her to be happy, hesitated. I knew she had been lonely since Dad passed, and I understood, at least logically, why she might want to move on. But why Rick? Of all people, why him? The conversation ended abruptly, with neither of us feeling satisfied. Over the next few weeks, I tried to avoid the topic, but it kept resurfacing. Mom would drop little hints about Rick, testing the waters to see if I'd warm up to the idea. She talked about how kind he was to her, how much they laughed together, and how he made her feel appreciated in ways she hadn't felt in years. I couldn't share her enthusiasm. Instead, I started pulling back, keeping conversations surface level and steering clear of anything that might lead back to Rick. Deep down, I felt guilty for not supporting her, but the discomfort was too much to ignore. Every mention of his name reminded me of Dad and the tension that had defined their relationship. It felt like a betrayal I wasn't ready to confront. Growing up, my dad didn't talk much about work at home. He believed in leaving professional stress at the office, but Rick was the exception. Anytime my dad brought him up, it was with unmistakable irritation. "That man," he'd say, shaking his head, his voice laced with exasperation. It was rare to see my dad so riled up over someone, but Rick had that effect on him. It wasn't just petty workplace disagreements. According to Dad, Rick was someone who thrived on stirring the pot, someone who refused to be a team player. My dad often described him as arrogant, dismissive, and needlessly combative. "He thinks he's better than everyone else," Dad would say, recounting another clash at work. Over time, it became clear that their animosity wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. The tension extended beyond office walls. I remember one instance when my dad ran into Rick at a store. Even as a kid, I could sense the icy atmosphere. My dad kept the interaction civil, but his tight-lipped expression spoke volumes. When we left, he muttered under his breath, "That guy is unbelievable." At the time, I didn't understand the full context, but the memory stuck with me. When my dad passed, Rick's absence on the condolence card felt symbolic. It was a small gesture, but it carried a lot of weight. It confirmed everything my dad had said about him, that he didn't care and never would. Now, knowing that this same man is a central figure in my mum's life, all those memories resurface with sharp clarity. It's like Dad's voice is still in my head, reminding me of who Rick is and what he represented in our family's story. It's hard to reconcile that with the man Mom describes so fondly now. I still remember the moment I realized Mom wasn't just casually dating Rick, she was in love with him. It happened during one of our Sunday lunches, a tradition we'd kept going even after Dad passed. She was buzzing with energy, talking about her week in a way that felt different. It wasn't just her words, it was the way she said them, like there was a lightness in her that hadn't been there in years. "I think I'm really happy," she said almost to herself as she refilled her coffee. It wasn't hard to guess who was behind that happiness. She hadn't mentioned Rick by name yet, but I knew. The way her eyes softened and the subtle smile that tugged at her lips gave it away. When she finally brought him up, it wasn't casual. She told me they had been spending more time together and that she felt a connection she hadn't expected. "It's like we understand each other," she said, her voice almost hesitant, as if she knew how I'd react. And I did react. My stomach twisted into knots, but I forced myself to keep my expression neutral. The turning point wasn't just for her. It was for me, too. This wasn't a fleeting romance. It was serious. Mom was building a future with Rick, and for the first time, I had to confront what that meant. It wasn't just about her happiness anymore. It was about how this would impact our family, my memories of Dad, and even my own future. I tried to engage, asking questions like, "What do you see in him? And are you sure this is what you want?" But every response she gave only deepened my unease. She described him as caring, attentive, and someone who brought joy back into her life. It was everything I wanted for her in theory, but the reality of who she'd found that with made it impossible to celebrate. It hit me that day. This wasn't just her life-changing, it was mine too, and I wasn't ready for it. The condolence card was something I hadn't thought about in years. It resurfaced in my mind like a painful bruise after Mum started talking about Rick in a more serious way. Back when Dad passed, his workplace had been overwhelmingly supportive. Colleagues sent flowers, meals, and a large card filled with heartfelt messages. It was a bittersweet reminder of how much he was respected and loved, but not everyone signed it. Mum noticed it first. She was sitting at the kitchen table rereading the messages, her finger tracing over the names. "Rick didn't sign it," she said, her tone sharp with disbelief. She didn't elaborate, but I could see the hurt in her expression. It wasn't about the card itself, it was about what his omission symbolized. Even in death, Rick couldn't set aside whatever resentment he held for Dad. At the time, I shrugged it off. Rick wasn't family. He didn't owe us anything. But deep down, it stung. It was a reminder of how deep their feud ran, a petty act that felt like a final jab at someone who wasn't there to defend himself. Now, with Rick back in the picture, the memory feels heavier. I think about how much that card meant to Mum and me in those first weeks after Dad died. It was a small but tangible comfort during an unimaginable loss. Rick's absence wasn't just noticeable, it was deliberate. It's hard to reconcile that man with the one my mom now calls loving and easy to care for. Whenever Mom tries to defend Rick's character, I can't help but remember that card. It's a detail she seems to have forgotten, but I can't. It sits there, quietly fueling my resentment, a reminder of why I can't just accept him in our lives. The first serious conversation about Rick came after months of tiptoeing around the topic. It wasn't planned, but the tension had been building, and it finally spilled over one evening while we were sitting in the living room. Mom had just finished talking about how she and Rick were planning a weekend getaway, her tone light and excited. I couldn't hold back anymore. "Do you really think this is a good idea?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She paused, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" she replied, her brows knitting together. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything I'd been holding in. "I mean Rick. Him. Of all people, why him? You know how Dad felt about him. You know how he treated us, even after Dad was gone. How can you just overlook all of that?" Her expression shifted, a mix of hurt and defensiveness. "I'm not overlooking anything," she said firmly. "I know their history, but that was between them. Rick's different now. He's been good to me, and I deserve to be happy." Her words hit me like a slap. "So his feelings about Dad don't matter anymore? The years of bad blood just vanish because he's nice to you now?" I snapped, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "Mom, he didn't even sign the condolence card. How do you justify that?" She looked away, her jaw tightening. "I'm not asking you to forget the past," she said quietly, "but people change, and maybe you don't see it yet, but he's not the person you think he is." I shook my head, frustration bubbling over. "Maybe he's changed for you, but that doesn't erase who he was to Dad, or to me. I can't just pretend everything's fine because you're happy." The conversation ended there, both of us too upset to continue. It was the first time we'd spoken so openly about Rick, but it didn't bring clarity. If anything, it left us more divided, with unspoken resentment hanging heavy in the air. After our heated conversation, things between Mom and me became strained. For the first time, I felt a rift growing between us, something that had never been there before. She wasn't cold or distant exactly, but there was a tension, a heaviness in our interactions that hadn't existed before. It was like we were speaking two different languages, neither of us willing, or maybe able, to fully understand the other. Mom didn't bring Rick up for a few days, which I assumed was her way of giving me space. But when she finally did, it was clear the topic was still weighing on her. "I need you to try to see this from my perspective," she said one evening as we sat across from each other. Her tone was softer than before, almost pleading. "I understand that this is hard for you," she continued, "but I can't live my life based on how you or anyone else feels about Rick. He makes me happy, and that's something I haven't felt in a long time. Can't you at least try to accept that?" Her words stung, but they also made me feel guilty. I knew she was lonely after Dad passed, and a part of me wanted to support her happiness. Still, I couldn't shake the discomfort. "I'm not telling you not to be with him," I replied carefully. "I'm saying I can't approve of it, and I need you to be okay with that." She frowned, clearly unsatisfied. "It's not just about you approving," she said. "It's about you being part of my life and sharing in my happiness. How am I supposed to do that when you're shutting him out?" I didn't have an answer for her. We sat in silence, both of us caught in the gap between what we wanted and what we could accept. The next flashpoint came during a conversation I wasn't prepared for. Mom and I were sitting in the backyard, enjoying a rare, peaceful afternoon together. She was in an unusually good mood, chatting about her plans for the future. I was doing my best to stay engaged, nodding along and keeping things light. Then she said it. "I'm really looking forward to sharing grandkids with Rick someday," she said, smiling as she sipped her tea. I froze. The words felt like a punch to the gut. I turned to her, trying to process what she had just said. "Sharing grandkids?" I repeated, my voice sharp. "Yes," she replied, her tone casual. "When you and your fiancé have kids, it'll be wonderful for Rick to be involved. He loves children, and I think he'd make a great grandfather." I couldn't hide my reaction. My face must have given away everything I was feeling: disbelief, anger, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. "That's not going to happen," I said firmly, setting down my drink. Mom's smile faltered. "What do you mean by that?" she asked. her voice tinged with confusion and a hint of defensiveness. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "I mean, Rick isn't going to be a grandfather to my kids," I said. "He's not going to be part of their lives like that." Her eyes narrowed, and I could see her frustration building. "That's unfair," she said. "You're punishing him for something that happened years ago, something that has nothing to do with the man he is now." I shook my head. "This isn't about punishing him. It's about my boundaries. I can't pretend that he and Dad didn't hate each other. I can't act like he's part of my family because he's not, and he never will be." The mood had shifted entirely. Mom looked at me, hurt and angry. "You're making this so much harder than it needs to be," she said quietly. "All I want is for us to be a family." But to me, the idea of including Rick in that family felt impossible. After the conversation about sharing grandkids, I realized this was no longer just about my mom's happiness. It was about my own sense of family and what I was willing to accept. I spent days replaying her words in my head, trying to understand where she was coming from, while also grappling with my own emotions. It felt like we were standing on opposite sides of a widening canyon, each unable to cross to the other. Family has always been sacred to me. Growing up, it was my dad who taught me the value of loyalty and respect, not just through words but through his actions. He was the kind of man who would do anything for the people he loved, and he made it clear that family came first. It's why his feud with Rick always felt so significant. It wasn't just a workplace disagreement, it was a violation of those values. For my mum to now invite Rick into the role of a grandfather, a role my dad should have had, felt like crossing a line I couldn't ignore. It wasn't about holding a grudge or refusing to move on. It was about protecting the memory of my dad and ensuring that the values he instilled in me weren't overshadowed by someone who had openly disrespected him. I also started to think about my future kids and the kind of family dynamic I wanted for them. Would they grow up hearing stories about my dad, only to have those memories contradicted by Rick's presence? Would I be forced to compartmentalize my grief and my love for my dad to accommodate someone who had never shown him respect? The more I thought about it, the clearer my boundaries became. My mum could love Rick, could even marry him, but he wouldn't be a part of my life in the same way. That was the line I needed to draw. For myself, for my future family, and for the memory of the man who meant everything to me. Amid all the tension with my mom, I leaned heavily on my fiancée for support. She's been my rock through this entire ordeal, always willing to listen and offer perspective when my emotions threaten to overwhelm me. But even her patience has been tested by the complexity of the situation. From the beginning, she understood my feelings about Rick. She never tried to convince me to accept him or dismiss my concerns as irrational. Instead, she focused on helping me navigate my relationship with my mom, reminding me that this wasn't just about Rick. It was about how we, as a couple, would handle challenges that affected our future family. When Mom brought up the idea of Rick as a grandfather, my fiancée was as stunned as I was. "That's a big assumption," she said when I told her. "I mean, it's not her decision to make, it's ours." Her words stuck with me. She was right. This wasn't just about my mom's happiness anymore. It was about the boundaries we wanted to set as a couple. Still, I could tell she was torn. She didn't want to add fuel to the fire between me and my mum, but she also felt strongly about protecting our future family dynamic. We had long, honest discussions about what Rick's role, if any, would be in our lives. She agreed that it would be impossible to ignore the history between him and my dad. "Your dad is still part of your life," she said one evening, "and he'll always be part of our family even if he's not here. It's not fair for anyone to expect you to compromise that." Her unwavering support has been a relief, but it's also made me more determined to hold my ground. Together, we decided that while my mom's relationship is her choice, the boundaries we set for our family are ours, and they are non-negotiable. The idea of boundaries became even clearer during another conversation with my mum. It started innocently enough, with her talking about how much she and Rick had been bonding over stories from their pasts. But then she brought up Dad. "Rick says he regrets how things were with your father," she said almost casually, as if that would be enough to smooth over decades of animosity. I felt my chest tighten. "He regrets it now?" I asked, my voice heavy with disbelief. "After everything that happened, now he feels bad? What about when Dad was alive, when he had every opportunity to fix things?" Mum sighed, clearly bracing herself for my reaction. "People change," she said. "I know their history wasn't great, but it doesn't have to define the future. Rick isn't proud of the way he handled things back then. I couldn't stop myself. But that's the thing, Mom. The way he handled things says everything about who he was. And whether or not he's changed now doesn't erase the past. How am I supposed to sit in the same room as him and pretend like he didn't hate my dad? She looked at me, her frustration evident. You're holding on to so much anger, she said. Your dad wouldn't want that. He'd want you to move forward. Her words stung. This isn't about anger, I said, my voice quieter now. It's about respect. Dad isn't here to speak for himself, so I feel like I have to. Letting Rick into our lives feels like erasing who Dad was, like saying his memory doesn't matter anymore. Mum softened a little at that, her eyes misting over. That's not what I'm trying to do, she said. I loved your father. I still do. But I need to live my life too. I didn't argue with her. I knew she believed what she was saying, but it didn't change how I felt. For me, preserving my dad's memory wasn't just about the past. It was about honoring the man who shaped my values, the man whose love and presence still echoed in everything I did, and I wasn't willing to compromise on that. As my fiancé and I started planning our wedding, the situation with Rick loomed larger than ever. Weddings are supposed to be joyful, a celebration of love and family, but the idea of him being there filled me with unease. It wasn't just his presence, it was the symbolism of it. This day was meant to honor the beginning of a new chapter in my life, one that my dad would have been so proud to witness. The thought of someone who disrespected my dad standing in his place felt deeply wrong. The discussions about the guest list became increasingly tense. My fiancé and I agreed early on that the wedding would include tributes to my dad. His favorite song would play during the reception, a seat would be reserved for him near the front, and there would be a moment of silence in his honor. These were non-negotiables for me. But the thought of how Rick might react to these tributes added another layer of stress. Would he sit there awkwardly, visibly uncomfortable? Would his presence diminish the significance of those moments? The idea made my stomach turn. When I brought it up to Mom, she brushed it off. Rick understands how important your dad was to you, she said. He won't make it about himself. That's not the point, I replied. It's not just about him sitting quietly. It's about the fact that he doesn't belong there in the first place. This is supposed to be about family, about honoring Dad. How can you expect me to celebrate with someone who disrespected him? Mom's frustration was palpable. He's part of my life now, she said. And whether you like it or not, that makes him part of your family. Her words hit me hard, but they didn't change my mind. To me, family wasn't something that could be redefined so easily. My dad's memory wasn't just a piece of the past. It was a cornerstone of who I was. And I wasn't willing to let anyone, least of all Rick, rewrite that. The wedding was for celebrating love, not for forcing reconciliation. As the situation with Rick became more prominent, it wasn't just my mom and I navigating the fallout. Friends and extended family started weighing in as well. Word had spread that Mom's new partner was someone my dad had openly disliked, and opinions were divided. Some relatives were supportive of her, emphasizing that she deserved happiness after everything she had been through. Others, however, were just as skeptical as I was. At family gatherings, Rick's name became an unspoken elephant in the room. Conversations tiptoed around him, and when his name did come up, it was always in hushed tones. My mom hated the tension. "Why can't people just give him a chance?" she asked me once, her frustration evident. But the truth was, Rick didn't make it easy for anyone to embrace him. Some family members remembered the stories Dad had shared about him, his arrogance, his inability to work well with others. They couldn't reconcile those stories with the man my mom now described as kind and loving. To them, it felt like Mom was rewriting history to fit her narrative, and that didn't sit well. My closest friends, on the other hand, were fiercely protective of me. When I confided in them about how much this situation was affecting me, their responses were unanimous. "You don't owe him anything." They reminded me that setting boundaries was a sign of self-respect, not selfishness. But not everyone saw it that way. A few people argued that I was being too rigid, that life was too short to hold on to grudges. "Maybe this is a chance to heal," one relative said during a family dinner. I nodded politely, but inside, I felt anything but healed. For me, this wasn't about holding a grudge. It was about staying true to the memory of my dad and the principles he stood for, and that wasn't something I could compromise. As much as I struggled with my mum's relationship with Rick, I couldn't ignore her perspective entirely. She'd been through so much since my dad passed. grieving not only the man she loved, but the life they built together. Losing him meant losing her partner, her confidant, and her sense of stability. I knew that loneliness had been her constant companion for years, and it wasn't something I could truly understand. Mom rarely opened up about her feelings, but when she did, it was always tinged with a vulnerability that stayed with me. She'd say things like, "Your dad was my first love, but he's gone. I can't live the rest of my life looking back." It wasn't that she wanted to replace Dad. She couldn't, but she was searching for a way to move forward, to find companionship in a life that suddenly felt so empty. Rick, for reasons I couldn't comprehend, had become that companion. She described him as patient and attentive, someone who made her feel seen and cared for in ways she hadn't felt in years. "I'm not trying to erase your father," she told me one evening. "I'm just trying to find happiness again. Is that so wrong?" Her words weren't easy to hear, but they forced me to think. Was I being unfair? Was I too focused on my own feelings to see what this relationship meant to her? Part of me wanted to empathize, to support her as she rebuilt her life. But every time I tried to step into her shoes, I felt the weight of my dad's memory pulling me back. I knew she deserved happiness. I wanted that for her, but not like this. Not with someone whose history with our family was so fraught. It felt like she was asking me to rewrite my own story, to accept a version of the future where my dad's presence was diminished to make room for someone I couldn't bring myself to embrace. And no matter how much I loved my mom, that was a line I wasn't sure I could cross. Forgiveness is something I've thought about a lot since this whole situation began. It's not that I don't understand the concept or value of letting go of resentment. I do. But in this case, forgiveness felt like a far more complicated and loaded idea. What exactly would I be forgiving Rick for? And more importantly, could I do it without feeling like I was betraying my dad? Rick and I don't have a personal history of conflict, but his history with my dad weighs heavily on me. Forgiveness in this context wouldn't just mean letting go of any lingering anger. It would mean acknowledging that the past doesn't have to define the future. It would mean accepting that people can change, even when their past actions have caused harm. But that's where I hit a wall. Rick's actions or inactions still feel so raw, even after all these years. How could I forgive someone who never showed my dad the respect he deserved, even in death? I also think about what forgiveness would look like in practice. Would it mean welcoming Rick into my life as if nothing had happened? Would it mean seeing him as a member of the family, someone who could share in our future milestones? I couldn't see a version of forgiveness that didn't feel like erasing my dad's legacy, and that thought was unbearable. At the same time, I wondered if my resistance to forgiveness was hurting me more than it was helping. Holding on to these feelings was exhausting, and I could feel the strain it was putting on my relationship with my mom. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize forgiveness, my heart refused to follow. It felt like my duty to my dad outweighed any potential for reconciliation, and that wasn't something I could just set aside. Not yet, anyway. Despite my resistance to Rick's involvement in our family, I couldn't ignore the way he positioned himself. He wasn't aggressive or pushy. If anything, he seemed cautious, almost calculated in his approach. He didn't try to force interactions with me, nor did he act as though he were oblivious to the tension. But his restraint didn't make me any more comfortable. It felt strategic, like he was waiting for the right moment to win me over. When he and Mom started spending more time at family gatherings, I kept my distance, observing more than engaging. Rick was polite to everyone, offering to help with small tasks and making casual conversation. He was careful never to overstep, but his presence felt like a quiet assertion. He was here to stay. Mom often defended him in these settings, explaining his good intentions to anyone who seemed hesitant. "He knows how awkward this is for everyone," she said to me after one gathering, "but he's willing to put in the effort because he cares about us." Us. The word made me bristle. Rick might have cared about her, but that didn't mean he cared about me, or about the family dynamic he was disrupting. His past actions didn't suggest a man eager to embrace our family. They suggested someone who had long been at odds with everything we stood for. At one point, Rick tried to bridge the gap with me directly. He approached cautiously, starting with small talk about my job, and gradually steering the conversation toward shared interests. While his tone was friendly, I couldn't shake the feeling that his effort was more about pleasing my mom than connecting with me. I gave polite but curt responses, making it clear I wasn't ready to engage on a deeper level. It wasn't that I wanted to be hostile. I just couldn't shake the weight of the history between him and my dad, a history that overshadowed every word and gesture he offered. The more I tried to process Rick's presence in our lives, the more I realized how deeply the past affected me. It wasn't just the long-standing animosity between him and my dad. It was the way that history shaped my perception of who Rick was and what he represented. Every time I looked at him, I saw a man who had openly disrespected my father, not just in life, but even in death. For years, my dad had painted a picture of Rick as someone fundamentally at odds with his values. To hear my dad tell it, Rick was arrogant, self-serving, and dismissive of the bonds that made a workplace or any relationship function. It wasn't just personal dislike, it was a clash of principles. My dad valued loyalty, fairness, and respect. Rick, by contrast, seemed to embody the opposite, at least in my dad's eyes. After Dad passed, Rick's absence from the condolence card felt like the final word in their unspoken battle. It wasn't just petty, it was pointed, a deliberate act that confirmed everything my dad had ever said about him. How could I reconcile that man with the one my mom now described as loving and kind? The disconnect was too great. Even now, as Rick made an effort to integrate himself into our family, the past loomed large. Mom insisted that he'd changed, that he regretted his actions and wanted to move forward. But to me, the past wasn't just a distant memory. It was an undeniable part of who Rick was. And while people might change, the impact of their actions doesn't just vanish. I tried to imagine a scenario where I could let go of that resentment, where I could see Rick as more than the man my dad despised. But every time I thought about it, I felt like I was betraying my dad's memory. It wasn't just about forgiving Rick. It was about honoring the values and principles my dad had instilled in me. And for now, that past felt too irreconcilable to move beyond. The question of my mum's happiness lingered in my mind constantly. Did she deserve to move forward and find joy again? Absolutely. I never doubted that. She had given so much of herself to our family, especially after my dad passed. Her grief was immense, and she carried it with grace, always putting me first during those difficult years. But the problem wasn't her happiness. It was how she was choosing to pursue it. It felt unfair, almost selfish, to say that her happiness should be conditional on my approval. Yet I couldn't help but feel like her decision to be with Rick ignored everything that had happened before. It wasn't just her history with him that mattered. It was ours. This wasn't a clean slate. It was a tangled web of unresolved feelings and deeply rooted conflicts. By choosing Rick, it felt like she was rewriting our family's story in a way that erased some of its most important chapters. At the same time, I knew she wasn't trying to hurt me. She truly believed that Rick made her happy, that he was giving her a second chance at companionship and love. I wanted to support her, to tell her I understood, but every time I tried, the words caught in my throat. It felt like doing so would mean betraying my dad. The guilt weighed heavily on me. I didn't want to be the person standing in the way of her happiness. I didn't want to be the reason she felt unsupported or unloved. But at the same time, I couldn't ignore my own feelings, my own boundaries. I was stuck between wanting to protect her joy and needing to protect my own sense of loyalty to my dad. It was a balance I wasn't sure I could ever truly find. Respect was at the heart of everything I struggled with in this situation. To me, respect wasn't just a surface-level courtesy. It was a core value, something you showed through your actions, especially toward the people who mattered most. My dad had always modeled this. Even when he disagreed with someone, he handled it with dignity. That's why Rick's behavior toward my dad felt so egregious. It wasn't just a personality clash. It was a fundamental lack of respect for the man my dad was. When Mom defended Rick, she often framed it as an issue of fairness. "You're not giving him a chance," she'd say. "You're judging him based on the past." But what she didn't seem to understand was that the past wasn't something I could just overlook. Rick's actions, or lack of them, spoke volumes about the kind of respect he had for my dad, and by extension for our family. For example, when Rick didn't sign the condolence card after my dad passed, it wasn't just a petty omission. It was a deliberate choice to distance himself from our grief, a refusal to acknowledge the loss we were experiencing. To me, that was more than disrespectful. It was hurtful. It sent a clear message that whatever issues he had with my dad outweighed any basic decency he might have shown toward the people left behind. Respect also extends to the way Rick has tried to integrate into our lives now. While he's been polite and careful not to overstep, it feels performative, like he's trying to win approval rather than genuinely connect. I can't help but see it as another layer of disregard for the history he shares with our family, a history he seems all too willing to brush aside. For my mum, respect seems to mean moving forward, focusing on the present, and letting the past stay in the past. For me, it means honoring the legacy of my dad, acknowledging the values he stood for, and refusing to let those be diminished. It's a divide we haven't been able to bridge, and it's one that continues to define our conflict. I've tried to picture what the future might look like with Rick in it. It's something I can't avoid, especially since my mom has made it clear that he's not going anywhere. But every time I think about holidays, family gatherings, or even casual visits, I feel a knot in my stomach. The idea of him being part of those moments feels wrong, like an intrusion into something sacred. What would it mean to have him sitting at the dinner table, surrounded by the people who loved and respected my dad? Would he feel like an outsider, or would he act as though he belonged? And how would I handle those moments when memories of my dad inevitably come up? I can't imagine Rick joining in those conversations, sharing stories or laughing along. The tension would be palpable, an unspoken reminder of the history we're all trying to ignore. Then there's the matter of my own family. My fiancé and I have talked about what it would mean to bring children into this dynamic. Would I have to explain to them one day who Rick was and what he represented? How could I tell them about their grandfather, my dad, while also making room for someone who disrespected him? It feels like an impossible balancing act, one that I'm not willing to perform. Even if I tried to be civil for my mum's sake, I know I wouldn't be able to hide my feelings entirely. Kids pick up on those things. They'd sense the discomfort, the unspoken tension, and that's not the kind of environment I want for them. I want their family to feel whole, filled with love and respect, not fractured by unresolved conflicts. No matter how I imagine it, the future with Rick feels like a compromise I'm not ready to make. It's not just about my comfort, it's about preserving the integrity of the family my dad worked so hard to build. As the reality of Rick's place in my mum's life became clearer, my fiancé and I had to have an honest conversation about what this dynamic would mean for our future children. It wasn't just about my feelings anymore. It was about the kind of family environment we wanted to create and what boundaries we needed to set to protect that. One evening, as we sat together in the quiet of our living room, I brought it up. "What do you think about all this?" I asked hesitantly. "About Rick and how he fits into everything?" She took a moment before answering, her expression thoughtful. "I think it's complicated," she said. "I can see how much this is hurting you, and I understand why you feel the way you do. But I also think we need to figure out what's best for us, especially if we're talking about kids someday." Her words were both comforting and sobering. We talked at length about how much influence Rick would have in our lives if he stayed with my mom. Would he expect to be treated like a grandfather? Would my mom push for him to have that role? And more importantly, how would that impact the way we taught our kids about family, loyalty, and respect? I made it clear that I didn't want Rick involved in our children's lives in a meaningful way. "It's not fair to them," I said. "They deserve to hear about their real grandfather without the confusion of someone else trying to take that place." She nodded in agreement, but reminded me that this would be a delicate line to walk. "Your mum loves him," she said gently. "If we cut him out entirely, it could cause even more strain with her." It was a valid point and one I hadn't fully considered. Striking a balance between protecting our family and maintaining some semblance of a relationship with my mom was going to be challenging. But in the end, we agreed that our children's well-being and my dad's legacy had to come first. It was a difficult decision, but it was one we felt confident in making together. As my mom's relationship with Rick deepened, so did her expectations of me. She wasn't just asking for tolerance anymore, she wanted full acceptance. For her, Rick wasn't just a partner, he was becoming part of the family, and she expected me to acknowledge that. The pressure she placed on me to embrace him grew with every conversation, and it was becoming harder to manage. One evening after dinner, she brought it up again. "You need to try harder," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "Rick isn't going anywhere. He loves me and he wants to be part of this family. I don't think it's fair for you to shut him out." Her words hit a nerve. "It's not about being fair," I replied, my voice tight. "It's about what I can and can't accept." You're asking me to forget everything about the way he treated Dad, about the history he has with our family. I can't just erase that. Mom sighed, frustration evident on her face. He regrets all of that, she said. He knows he made mistakes and he wants to make things right, but how can he if you won't even give him a chance? I felt a surge of anger rise up. Making things right doesn't mean pretending the past didn't happen, I said. It doesn't mean forcing him into a role he doesn't belong in. You're asking me to rewrite my own memories to make you feel better, and I can't do that. She looked at me for a long moment, her eyes filled with disappointment. I just want us to be a family, she said softly. Is that so much to ask? It was heartbreaking to hear her say that because I knew how much it meant to her. But for me, family wasn't something that could be forced. It was built on trust, respect, and shared history. And Rick didn't fit into that picture. No matter how much she wanted it, I couldn't give her the acceptance she was looking for. Rick wasn't oblivious to the tension. He knew I wasn't thrilled about his presence in my mum's life, and he seemed to sense the boundaries I'd placed between us. For the most part, he respected them. He didn't try to push conversations too far or force interactions, but his restraint felt calculated, like he was playing the long game, waiting for an opportunity to change my mind. One day, during a family gathering, Rick approached me in what felt like an attempt to clear the air. It wasn't confrontational. If anything, his tone was disarmingly casual. I know this hasn't been easy for you, he said, holding his coffee mug like it was a shield. I just want you to know, I'm not here to replace anyone. I respect your dad and what he meant to you and your mum. His words caught me off guard. They sounded rehearsed, like something he'd practiced in front of a mirror. Part of me wanted to appreciate the effort, but another part couldn't get past the history we shared. Respecting my dad would have looked different when he was alive, I replied, my voice calm but firm. It's hard to believe that now, after everything. Rick nodded, as if he'd expected the response. I don't blame you for feeling that way, he said. I just hope in time we can move forward. His measured reaction frustrated me more than an argument would have. It felt like he was trying to position himself as the bigger person, someone who could rise above the conflict. But for me, it wasn't about moving forward. It was about addressing the past. And Rick's role in that past wasn't something I could ignore. After that conversation, Rick pulled back even further. He stopped trying to engage directly and focused instead on solidifying his bond with my mom. While I appreciated his restraint, it also reinforced my belief that his actions were more about pleasing her than genuinely connecting with me. It was another reminder that no matter how hard he tried, Rick would never truly belong in the space my dad had left behind. The more I thought about my mom's relationship with Rick, the more I realized it wasn't just about him. It was about what love and loyalty meant to me. My dad had always embodied those values. He was fiercely loyal, not just to our family, but to his principles, his friends, and even his co-workers. Except Rick, of course. His love wasn't loud or showy, but it was steady, dependable, and undeniable. It was the kind of love that left a legacy, one that I felt compelled to honor. My mom's love for Rick, on the other hand, felt different. It wasn't built on years of shared history or mutual sacrifice. It felt to me like a response to her loneliness, a way of filling the void my dad's death had left. That wasn't necessarily a bad thing. She deserved companionship and happiness. But the way she chose to pursue it felt like a betrayal of the loyalty we both had to my dad. I struggled to reconcile my loyalty to my dad with my love for my mom. They weren't at odds, but the situation with Rick made it feel that way. Every time I resisted her efforts to integrate Rick into our family, it felt like I was letting her down. But every time I considered giving in, I felt like I was letting my dad down. Loyalty, for me, wasn't just about being there for someone in the present. It was about honoring their memory and the values they stood for. And my dad's feelings about Rick weren't just a footnote in his story. They were a testament to his integrity, his unwillingness to compromise on what he believed was right. To accept Rick now felt like erasing that part of him, and I couldn't bring myself to do it. Love, I realized, isn't always about saying yes. Sometimes it's about drawing lines, even when it's painful. My loyalty to my dad and my love for my mum felt like opposing forces, but they were both guiding me toward the same conclusion. I couldn't sacrifice one for the other. Not now, and maybe not ever. It was late one evening when my mum and I had what I now think of as our final major discussion about Rick. We had danced around the subject for months, each of us digging in our heels, but neither wanting to push the other too far. That night, the tension came to a head. We were sitting in her living room, the TV on in the background. Though neither of us was paying attention, she turned to me, her face serious. "I need to know where we stand," she said. "Rick and I are planning our future together, and I can't keep living in this in-between space with you." I felt my chest tighten. I'd been dreading this conversation, but I knew it was inevitable. "I've told you how I feel," I said carefully. "You're free to marry him, to build whatever life you want with him, but I can't pretend to approve of it." Her eyes softened, but I could see the disappointment there. "It's not about approval," she said. "It's about you being part of this family. I want to share my happiness with you, to know that we're not divided." I sighed, struggling to find the right words. "I want to be part of your life, Mom. But this is the line I have to draw. Rick will never be part of my family. Not in the way you want him to be. I'll be polite, I'll be civil, but I won't pretend to feel something I don't." She looked at me for a long moment, her expression a mix of hurt and understanding. "I guess that's all I can ask for," she said quietly. The conversation ended there, not with resolution, but with a fragile acceptance. It wasn't what either of us wanted, but it was the best we could manage, for now at least. As I reflected on everything, my dad's legacy, my mum's happiness, and my own boundaries, I realized that this situation wasn't going to have a perfect resolution. There was no way to reconcile every emotion, no way to make everyone feel completely satisfied. What mattered most was staying true to myself while still preserving the relationships I cared about. I decided to let go of trying to control the outcome. My mum's choices were hers to make, and I couldn't change them. What I could control was how I responded and how I protected the space my dad still held in my life. That meant maintaining my boundaries with Rick while doing my best to keep the connection with my mom intact. I spoke with my fiancé about it again, ensuring we were on the same page. We agreed that Rick would never have a central role in our lives or in the lives of our future children. My dad's memory and the values he instilled in me would remain at the forefront of how we shaped our family. We also decided to approach the situation with compassion for my mum, even when we disagreed with her choices. It wasn't about creating conflict. It was about protecting what mattered to us. When I shared this decision with my mum, I kept the conversation calm and straightforward. "I love you and I always will," I told her, "but my feelings about Rick aren't going to change. I can respect your decision to be with him, but I need you to respect my boundaries too." She nodded, her expression resigned but understanding. "I just hope that with time things might get easier," she said. "Maybe they will, maybe they won't. But for now, I'm at peace with where things stand. I've accepted that some parts of this situation will always feel unresolved, and that's okay. My dad's legacy remains strong, my relationship with my mum continues in its own way, and I've built a future with my fiancé that honors the past while looking forward. It's not perfect, but it's enough, and sometimes enough is all we can ask for."